Now, I do think that one political and social reality of ACA is that with Obamacare, the framers of Obamacare own many of the very difficult trade-offs that are real in the lives of real people. They own a lot of those issues, which have always been very contentious and heart-wrenching issues in our health insurance system, but which now people are saying, hey, because of the federal government, I can't get X, Y, or Z. I assure you, if someone is on Medicaid who has stage 4 cancer, it is not a new issue. Can they get to Stanford? Can they get to MD Anderson? Can they get to the Mayo Clinic? And the answer is often no, depending on where they live and which provider they want to go to. But this is a group of organized middle-class people who felt that they had access to those things and now are worried about it and are saying, you, the federal government, are interfering with me in this way. And that's a very explosive.
You're absolutely right. And a couple of things about that. First of all, I think John Cohn at the New Republic made the point in a recent piece that the shrinking of provider networks is something that's been going on for several years. It's an artifact of commercial health insurance, and it's certainly not new. It may, in some respects, have accelerated because of the ACA, but it's not novel, as you put it. And certainly, most people who are confronting it will think it's novel and are feeling it. And as I said, even when I wrote about Deborah Cavallaro, it's not an illegitimate concern if you do, especially if you're a sufferer from a chronic condition. To be able to keep your doctors, or at least have reasonable access, even if they're out of network. So that is legitimate. So I think that's true. But when you talk about the fact that the drafters and the enactors of the Affordable Care Act own these problems, that's true, but I go back to Franklin Roosevelt when I think about how do you deal with that. One thing that we learn when we study FDR is that he was an absolute master at making sure that the public, that the voters, always knew what was at stake when they were voting for him or against him, and when they were contemplating his programs. And it was a great example in 1938, he had to, the recovery had slowed, unemployment had ticked up again, and he went on the radio. It was one of his fireside chats, and he said, I'm instituting a new program, a stimulus program. In fact, it was the first genuine fiscal stimulus program of the New Deal 5 years after he had taken office. But he made sure that they understood what had happened in the years since he took office. He said, your money in the bank is safe. It wasn't before. He said, the chicanery on Wall Street, we have brought that to an end. It wasn't before. In the Farm Belt, farmers are getting income that enables them to invest in their business and their farms that they were not able to do before we took office. And he ticked off all these things. We don't see that from the Democrats or the White House, certainly as much. Now, it's not really fair to say, well, Barack Obama should be FDR, and he's not FDR, because Franklin Roosevelt was a unique political talent in this country. We haven't seen his like before or since, and we may never again. And he was particularly good at it. But we certainly can draw lessons from that you cannot leave the field. And what I've seen over and over again from the Democratic Party after enacting the ACA is that their instinct has been to run from it when it's being challenged or when problems come up. And we saw this in the 2010 elections, where I thought it was a huge blunder for Democratic candidates to not stand up and take credit for what was a real achievement. I think we saw it again in 2012, and we are seeing it now. I mean, this wholesale rush a few weeks ago to introduce and enact laws that would allow people to keep these low-grade individual policies that were being canceled, and even to require insurance companies to sign up more people for them. We know that this would have undermined everything else about the ACA. And it was Democrats who were right up there pushing them. And I thought that was just an atrocious blunder. I think that's ebbed now, and we can look forward to Saturday and Sunday and hope that the rebooting of healthcare.gov will put a lot of this to rest. But that is really a mistake, and we really need, I think President Obama is beginning to do that more. He needs to do it even more. And all of the other Democrats and other supporters of the ACA and the insurance industry also really need to step up and make sure that the public understands what's at stake in the Affordable Care Act and what would happen if it went away again.
I agree with that. I do think, by the way, that there's the reality that they botched the rollout of healthcare.gov, and I've been a defender of the law for a long time, and I'm proud of the law. I'm proud of President Obama. This was there was a very serious performance failure in healthcare.gov, and now I think in part, and for some of the things that you said, that there was a failure in preparing the public for the complexity of this, independent of the website issue, although the website issue made it worse in a number of ways. And that created when you take a political hit like that, which is not, we've spent a lot of time arguing about death panels. As a defender of the law, I've spent most of the last 5 years arguing about stuff that was completely bogus. And this is obviously different. It was a real thing. And of course, individual politicians then scurry for cover, and this the dynamic that that you have where we're all much better off if we stick together, but it's hard for us to do. I do think that people will. I agree with you that I'm hopeful, especially the website works much better now. What do you think is going to happen over the next couple of months with Obamacare?
Well, I think if the website works better, and yeah, the signs certainly are that we're moving in that direction. A lot of this is just going to go away. I think what we're finding is that, first of all, I think the media narrative finally is beginning to shift, because I think the idea, these stories of people losing their insurance and facing explosive premiums, sticker shock and all that, that's maybe on the verge of playing out. One can only hope. And then what's going to happen is that the narrative of people who are discovering that they can get insurance for the first time, who are happy with what they're finding out there, that it may well be that now becomes the next narrative. Now, it's going to be every bit as superficial as it's portrayed in the press as the last narrative, but at least it will be closer to the experience of the vast majority of beneficiaries of the Affordable Care Act. And I think we will learn. If the website continues to work, and if all of the states get their acts together, then I think we will look back on this and say, well, that was a rough rollout, but we've survived it, and the story will go away.
I must say, I think I view that as
that's
very much what I'm hoping will take place. I think there is some element of optimism in that, and for a couple of reasons. One is many of the beneficiaries of ACA were always going to be people who were not well physically, who were disorganized. We have 50 million uninsured people in America who get less press than much smaller numbers of people who have less profound life problems. And our political system is just not designed to focus the laser beam on people in Texas who should be getting Medicaid but who aren't, because their governor doesn't want to offer that, even though the federal government would pay virtually the entire bill. We have a political system that so overweights the influence of organized upper middle class people like me compared to many other people, and there is this, and I do think that there's this general, it's a humiliating thing what happened initially with this rollout, and we'll see how the narrative goes. But I agree with you that the story will change. And one good thing I think is that the story, even now, the debate is about the reality of what ACA is. We're not talking about fictional death panels. We're talking about how do we deal with the real experiences of people. And of course, since the real experiences of people are so varied, it's often a very anecdotal conversation. From a health policy point of view, you'd love for this conversation to be higher quality. But at least it's about the real stuff. And how do we balance the need to keep premiums down with the need to give people access to their doctor? You mentioned Stanford and MD Anderson and UCSD. One of the questions that has to be in the conversation is, well, how much do these places charge for care? And, they are wonderful institutions. My dad just got care for kidney cancer at Brigham and Women's Hospital and at the Harvard Teaching Hospitals, and we are so profoundly grateful for that. But there are economic realities. These are self-interested institutions that charge a lot of money, and insurers need to have some ability to have pushback against that. And if we weaken that, then we will ultimately pay higher premiums, and we have to have an adult conversation about how to balance those different issues.
That's true. That's a very difficult conversation to have as adults. And I would say, going back to one of the points you made just a moment or two ago, by their nature, these are the evidence that gets put before people on television and in the newspapers is anecdotal. And in fact, I just posted a piece on Monday that had, I think, maybe a half a dozen examples of people who either had lost their insurance or were being insured for the first time under the ACA, and were going to do very, very well. Either one was going to pay a little bit more, but get a lot more in benefits for his family. Others had been turned down and were now going to be eligible. Some were getting subsidies. And I acknowledge up front, these are anecdotes, just like the anecdotes you've heard about sticker shock. But the difference is that these conform a lot more to what we know statistically about the community of people who the ACA is aimed at. 30 million, a market for individual insurance of 30 million Americans, 20 million of whom don't have insurance now. Leaves 10 million, maybe, some small percentage of whom are going to pay more. But, we have to keep all these numbers in perspective.
Michael, thank you so much for talking with me today. I really enjoyed talking to you, and I think you and I share many social values, and I admire that, we live in an age of irony and snark, and one of the things, in addition to your reporting, one of the things that I enjoy about your writing is the unironic way in which you state some important values. And I think there is a continuous stream from the New Deal era, through Medicare and Medicaid to today about the need to take care of each other. And the ACA, for all of its kludginess and compromises and imperfections in its implementation, is an expression of those key social values that keeping, and it is important to keep those things front and center in the way that you do. So I really appreciate the work that you do.
Well, thanks. And I've learned a lot from following your work as well. And I should say that, for all that's happened with the ACA and all the questions that have been raised about social insurance and Medicare and Medicaid, I think that this country in general still, Roosevelt and the New Deal really changed fundamentally the relationship between government and its people. And Americans still very much believe that, despite what we keep being told about how we can't afford it. It is really not the way most Americans really think.
On that note, I will bring this conversation to a close, and thanks for another great edition of Curbside Consult.